Okay. Good. Okay. So I think we'll start. And hello, everybody in the room and everybody online. And welcome to this, which is the fourth and the last in a series of seminars hosted by the Alan Turing Institute, and particularly the AI and the Arts interest group. And we're delighted to be here and grateful to be hosted. So our topic today, which comes after 3 seminars where we gave some of the fruits of our research in the last 2.5 years, is new pedagogies. So our title is Towards Radically Interdisciplinary AI Pedagogies. And this is a sort of a part of a larger research program called Music and AI, Building Critical Interdisciplinary Studies, or MusAI for short. And it's based at UCL in London, and I'm the PI, and my name is Georgina Born. So just some logos. Why? I don't know, but we're meant to do it. Funded by the ERC, which is a wonderful funding body that lets us do rather crazy and interesting experimental work. So here are the 4 seminars. We're at the 4th, and you'll see the topics of the first 3 that we've already had. First one was looking at alternative designs of recommendation systems. The second was about copyright after generative AI, which we were grateful to hold in Edinburgh at InSpace. And the third was about compositional uses of AI, and was called AI and Practice-Based Research in Music and the Arts. And we held that up in Manchester at the Royal Northern College of Music. Again, very grateful for that. So the aim of these seminars is to present our work, which is very much still in progress, but also to invite you and those online to engage with us in thinking together. That's really what we're trying to do. Here's the front page of our website. Please go and look at it. WordPress site there. A shot from a rehearsal for a piece by Artemi Maria Giotti with the pianist Xenia Pestova-Bennett that we held in late November 2022. And more about the MusAI program, 5 years. And its theme is looking at the cultural implications of AI through critical studies examining its relationship with music. So we take music as the kind of lens or the petri dish for addressing this quite broad question of AI's cultural implications. And here is a slide with the 10 research projects that make up the whole program. And you can see that we've got now to the bottom here, which is the second stage of the program's work on prototyping radically interdisciplinary music AI pedagogies. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So why MusAI? What is this program about? I want to explain the rationale. So, you know, we've got, as many of you in the room will know, we have an escalating body of academic, but also policy work, focusing on the social and ethical implications of AI. But when I wrote the proposal, at least, which is now a couple of years ago, there was no major research initiative at the time looking at AI's cultural implications, which of course is currently exploding around generative AI and its implications for creativity and cultural production. So it was in this context that the MusAI program takes music as the medium through which to initiate a field of critical interdisciplinary studies examining AI's implications for culture. And this is in the context, again, many of you will know that there are quite a lot of grants actually going to both technological development in music AI and to creative practice in the field, but critical research seemed to me to be at an early stage and not to be getting those big grants. And of course, the point about critical research is that it's not a sort of negative exercise. The aim is to seed new approaches, new paradigms to AI, and indeed to music making, to musical and creative practices. Now, to achieve that, a premise of the program is that we need new approaches that cut across entrenched disciplinary, methodological, and epistemological divisions. So what we've done in the program is support computer scientists, engineers, other kinds of scientists to hold rich and sustained interdisciplinary dialogues with social scientists, humanists, musicians, and artists. And that's a lot of what we've been doing for the last couple of years. And our aim is to prototype new forms of radical interdisciplinarity for AI music and indeed more broadly for the digital humanities. And our aim is that in the second stage of this program, which begins this autumn, October 24, all of this will feed into experiments in these new AI pedagogies and trainings. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're looking ahead, it's very prospective. And I really want to issue a plea, which is, join us. Please get in touch. If this is your area, you're excited by it, you want to do things too, we'd love to hear from you. We're trying to cultivate, in fact, we are cultivating new networks, collectives, groups, related to several areas of our work. So here we are. I'm now going to speak about this second stage of our work. We're trying to experiment with and prototype, we will be trying to experiment in new radically interdisciplinary AI pedagogies. We're aiming mainly at graduate students, master's and PhD students, training to develop and to use AI technologies. And we're going to do that in relation to two constituencies, students in music and the arts. And here we're very lucky to have a connection to the University of Arts London via my colleague, Rebecca Fiebrink, who will be speaking a little later, but also more generally in computer science. And there we're working up our connections both at my institution, UCL, but we have links to Carnegie Mellon in the States, where one of our key collaborators works, to UNSW in Sydney. Ollie Bown, who will speak shortly, is based there. But we also envisage this experimental work potentially generating public-facing pedagogies, possibly MOOCs, and other kinds of formats and resources. So we're trying to think in a very sort of open, generative way. And as I said earlier, we're at a very early stage in this. So why? Why do this now? Well, we were picking up at the time of writing this proposal much wider concerns. I'm going to give you some examples. So in a minute, I'll show a quote from Meredith Whittaker and Kate Crawford at the AI Now Institute, who call for what they call a deeper interdisciplinarity in and around AI. And they cite an MIT initiative advocating interdisciplinary trainings in computing, social sciences, and humanities. And at the time I wrote, King's College London, Arizona State, and UNSW had announced a kind of consortium for a new initiative to train what they called socially aware engineers. So a core goal of this second stage is to produce research to feed into this discussion, these new trainings. As I said, we're going to research and hope to prototype some innovative pedagogies for these training needs. And if I had a headline, it would be this, that our core aim is to go beyond ethics to educate informed, reflexive, creative AI professionals. So ethics as a form of interdisciplinarity, I'm going to argue, is insufficient, as though the structural issues embodied so well by the corporate AI industry can be solved by adding a touch of ethics to make AI corporations and practitioners better, more moral actors. If you wanted a great statement on what I've just said, you'd go and look at, as I mentioned, Whitaker and Crawford's AI Now report from 2018, where they speak about this deeper interdisciplinarity that we should be looking for beyond ethics. And I've got a few quotes up there. I won't go through them all. But they cite universities, among them Harvard, NYU, Stanford, and MIT, offering new courses on ethical AI development practices aimed at identifying issues and considering the ramifications of technological innovation before it's implemented at scale. But they go on, developing socially just AI systems requires more than ethical language. There's an obvious need for accountability in the industry, yet, they continue, the move towards ethics is not meeting this need. And really, I hope I'm preaching to the converted here, you know, that the whole discussion in Europe, in Britain, in the States about regulating AI is one of the responses to the current situation. So to better understand the complexities of AI systems, say Whitaker and Crawford, we've got to look beyond the technology and the hype to account for the broader context of how AI is shaping and shaped by social and material forces. And those, many of you who know Kate Crawford's work will know how absolutely extraordinary and outstanding her work is in this area. And they call for this deeper interdisciplinarity. They go on, AI researchers and developers are engaged in building technologies that have significant implications in broad fields like law, sociology, and medicine. Yet much of this development happens far removed from the experience and the expertise of these disciplines. We must expand the disciplinary makeup of those engaged in AI design, development, and critique beyond purely technical expertise, they contend. So I think we should ask what's at stake here. And I want very briefly and inadequately to contextualize historically. There are long-standing challenges around the question, the problem of interdisciplinarity in relation to science and engineering. And what's fascinating, actually, is to consider how these challenges remain as yet unmet. If we think, I'm now taking the British genealogy here, you know, we've had a series of paradigms from the mid-20th century on addressing and calling for attention to this question, this problem. C.P. Snow, 1959, his very famous essay, The Two Cultures, where he says the clashing point of two disciplines, two cultures, he's talking about the sciences and the humanities, ought to produce creative chances. In the history of mental activity, that has been where some of the breakthroughs came. Yet in practice, he says, the two cultures can't talk to each other. And Western society is split into two polar groups, humanities intellectuals and physical scientists. And we can fast forward to the mid-80s and the arrival of a famous paradigm, sometimes called PUS, Public Understanding of Science, announced by a Royal Society report, which said among many other things, quote, no pupil should study only arts or only science, even after the age of 16, and called for greater efforts by scientists to communicate with the public. And what's fascinating here, if you look at this carefully, is that this is what became known as a deficit model. It's predicated on the idea that the public doesn't understand science, and science is fine. Science is complete, and it doesn't need to change. It's the public that has to be educated to grasp what it is, what it's about. And by the mid-90s, a new paradigm arrives. The AHRC, the Arts Council, England, Wellcome Trust, Nesta, get into this art science idea. Number of initiatives, funding programs. A new fellowship scheme, which, to quote a paper at the time, would be an ideal ground for connecting art and science and privileging openness and knowledge sharing across disciplines. And finally, this all gives way to the public engagement paradigm from about 2009-10, when, to quote the Wellcome Trust, the arts can provide imaginative ways of engaging and educating young people in the field of science. But once again, even this public engagement paradigm, which talks about stakeholder juries and citizen science, so on and so forth, still predicated on this idea that the science is fine, right? It's about engagement, a sort of some kind of proto-democratizing engagement with people. So what's very interesting and obvious about all these paradigms is that the science itself and scientific trainings are deemed, not, complete. They don't have to change. And I think that's the kind of moment we've hit now, where that whole approach is problematic. So if not ethics, then how can we achieve a deeper transformative interdisciplinarity? What would it look like? So before I get to the concrete, and I'm coming towards the end, I just want to point to 3 distinctive forms or modes of interdisciplinarity that are out there. And my reference here is a book that I co-edited with Andrew Barry called Interdisciplinarity from 2013. I draw that from the research we did. So these 3 modes, the first, it will be familiar to you. We call it the synthesis model, and we're not alone. There's a Harvard project that describes precisely the same. And what happens then is that 2 or more disciplines come together, sit around the table, talk, collaborate, but they don't change, right? They stay disciplinary. And this is often, of course, what's called multidisciplinarity. The second form of interdisciplinarity, I'm going to call the subordination mode, and it's when 1 or more disciplines occupy a subordinate role in relation to other disciplines and are conceived as sort of making up or filling in for an absence or a lack in the master disciplines. And those master disciplines are often the sciences and engineering, and what often happens is that they summon the arts or the humanities or the social sciences in to add, a touch of the social or the cultural or the aesthetic to their ongoing work. But once again, the sciences stay there unchanged, right? So sort of drafting in to kind of make up little gaps in the program. And very familiar to us now is, the arts being expected to provide a service to science by rendering it more popular or communicable or accessible to a lay public, or by enhancing or aestheticizing aspects of science or scientific representations. So those 2 we're familiar with, they exist a lot. But when we did our research, we identified a 3rd mode, which we think is the most interesting, and we think it's what we ought to be concerned with in our work. And we call it the agonistic mode of interdisciplinarity. And it's when interdisciplinarity springs from a reflexive dialogue with, criticism of, or opposition to the limits of established disciplines, or the status of academic research or instrumental knowledge production. And what happens when you get people working in this way together, interdisciplinarily, is that you can see radical shifts in knowledge practices that are both epistemic and even, on occasion, ontological. If you're interested in that more, take a look at the book. So what we're about here is being interested in this kind of agonistic interdisciplinarity, which is predicated on criticisms of where AI science is going some of the time at the moment. And we want to look at those problems, those limits, and we want to envisage new kinds of engagement that could take us into new spaces. Now, a couple of qualifications. Of course, the sciences and engineering are themselves highly interdisciplinary in certain ways, a hybrid, and we need to bear that in mind. But the crucial point, I think, for our project and for us today is that in our vision, the sciences and the engineering of AI may need to change through interdisciplinary infusions, engagements, transformations, through these agonistic engagements with the arts, humanities, and social sciences. So I'm nearly at the end. This is just about my last slide, and I want to just be a bit more concrete. In the last couple of weeks, we've been sitting down together. This is a group of about 16 people engaging in those 10 research projects. And we've been brainstorming to kind of try to pull out what do we think on the basis of these projects needs to be in there, okay? Quite how? You can ask us. But we've identified, I think, about 5 key areas, often interrelated. So a first move would be to historicize, yeah? To situate AI historically and culturally through different AI paradigms, through the historical links to psychometrics, to cognitive science, to cognitive psychology, to notice the Western centrism of AI and this trajectory, the post-war US hegemony in science and technology and the links to corporate tech, the links to modernization paradigms post-war. So all these and more forms of historicizing what's going on here. A second area we think has to be addressed are, if you like, social and material contexts and critiques. And if we zoom out, we have all the work on platform and data and surveillance capitalism. We're very interested, because this is very particular to AI research and development, we're very interested in the academic industry connections and relations, very strong in music in Britain. We could draw on the literatures on political ecology, on resource extraction, on the forms of imperialism that clothe these kinds of resource extraction, all of them going into the material infrastructures of AI. But we can also zoom in close up and be interested in the MusAI startup economy and culture, in music information retrieval, data science in music, their ecologies, their cultures, their values. And Ollie Bown will be speaking about that in a few minutes. A third area would take us to epistemological and methodological questions. And I'm not going to say anything more because Owen Green will speak about that in a second. A fourth area on our list would be to pick up some of the key insights, the low-hanging fruit from science and technology studies, now so well developed. Ideas of configuring the user for engineers to become familiar with the idea that their design is always envisaging particular kinds of users, particular kinds of uses. The idea of purification, that the technological is separate from culture, rather than being interested in the messy connections, entanglement of technology, the culture and the social. And indeed, as a colleague in our project said, it's culture all the way down. And the whole question of culture is very rising up fast on the AI professionals' agenda too, at the moment. And our fifth area, I think, about which Rebecca will speak a little later, is critical artistic practice. Asking what do musicians and artists need for a critical reflexivity in relation to AI, and what do they bring from their critical interdisciplinary practice to our insights into AI. So 2 last points, I think. First would be that, whenever one speaks about interdisciplinarity to, say, graduate students, there's a lot of anxiety. And people say, oh my God, it's impossible. What you're asking for, it's a mountain to climb. And I think we're talking already, and we're going to talk a lot more about this. It's a perspective that I don't think is really necessary. I think we can, in fact, reassure our graduate students about the tasks involved in picking up sufficient insight into some key areas that their own thinking begins to evolve. And the second point would be about the realities of employment conditions today. Labor markets, soaring precarity and inequality, and therefore the whole incentive structures and the kinds of instrumentalism that tend to enter into trainings today. You know, people asking, how do I make a living? Quite understandably. So I'm going to finish, and we will have 3 presentations now, 15 minutes each, and then we'll stop for Q&A and discussion. Owen's going to speak first, then we have Oliver Bown online, all the way from Sydney. Thank you, Ollie. And then we have Rebecca here again in the room. So thanks very much.
Oh, I need a mic.
Oh, yeah, gosh, I forgot for a minute. Okay. So, voila.
So. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Oh, that's weird. Thanks for coming. Sorry, my slides look a bit ropey. It turns out the only way I can see my notes is to share a little bit of my screen that big, which has my slides on it. This is going to be quite a quick fire thing that arises out of some of the early work that we've already done on this project called Sonic Social Genre. And I'm going to kind of whiz through a bit the portion of that work that's informing this talk, and kind of suggest that many of the problems that this work is suggesting that we found in a particular strain of music information retrieval research have a kind of epistemological flavor, and that better preparing engineers and other users of machine learning for work that is actually radically interdisciplinary but also robust may be complementary aims, so that more radical approaches to interdisciplinarity might actually make for better science. And I'm going to kind of offer up 3 pretty speculative and pretty fuzzy sort of desiderata for an enhanced pedagogy along these lines, which hopefully kind of inform the discussion. So yeah, this project, Sonic Social Genre, it's a kind of 2-year chunk out of this big 5-year program with Georgina Born and Bob Sturm at KTH in Stockholm and Melanie Vold-Filman at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. And there's kind of 2 main strands to this project. The big one is sort of going through case studies, via case studies, to find and explore modeling approaches adequate to engaging with and building on rich theories of genre that come from Georgina's work and David Brackett's work in the social sciences and humanities. And that's where the radical interdisciplinarity is sort of coming into this work. And a substrand, which actually forms more of the basis from what I'm talking about today, comes through revisiting and extending a survey that Bob Sturm did 10 years ago, looking at music informatics research into genre recognition. And in that, he developed some sharp criticisms of the sort of the standard of scientific work in that corpus. And this is where the kind of the hopes for robust science come from. So Bob's survey paper in 2014 was a sort of culmination of quite a few sort of previous papers that he'd done building up to that, looking in quite close detail at genre recognition research. He went through a corpus of about 475 publications, mostly between, I think, 2001 and 2012. and found sort of widespread shortcomings in the way that experiments were designed, that the data were interrogated and the results were evaluated. For instance, the sort of main data set that's used is this one called GTZAM, which is one of the earliest ones, has some serious errors in it. And if you don't take account of those errors, the amount of faith that you can put in any experiment that uses that data is pretty limited. But moreover, he found examples of systems that only appear to have learned what the researchers hoped, but in fact had sort of learned to reproduce the right answers by entirely incorrect means. And this is quite a fundamental theme for a lot of the rest I'm going to say. And to illustrate this pathology, Bob latched onto this kind of parable of clever horses, based on the story of Clever Hans the Counting Horse from early 20th century Germany. Clever Hans appeared to be able to count. And if you gave him a cue, he'd kind of tap his hoof that many times. And everyone was amazed by this. But after much investigation, they eventually worked out how it was that Clever Hans was doing this. And it had nothing to do with counting at all, of course. He was picking up on pretty subtle cues from his handler. So for Bob, this is a really good analogy for the ways that we can mislead ourselves, particularly with machine learning systems, and particularly with the sort of very opaque deep models that have been picked up in this research, where you can appear to be getting amazing results, but it turns out that actually it's learned something entirely different. You sort of put it out into the world and nothing useful happens. So the moral here is that interrogating these systems to find out whether or not you've actually made yourself a clever horse actually requires a good portion of imagination, right? The problem with a lot of the research that Bob was looking at is that they'd trot out standard figures of merit, like the easiest ones to graph for, like the accuracy of the system. How often is it right relative to how often is it wrong? But that doesn't tell you anything about what it's learned. And what's actually required is a degree of imagination and creativity, and perhaps even mischief, in order to actually try and get at what's going on inside this black box. So in our update of this survey, Bob and I are reviewing a further maybe 500 or more papers from 2013 to 22. It's been hellish, but we're nearly at the end of the data entry and analysis. And as well as sort of recording some of the same features that Bob was looking at in the first place, like the experimental designs and the evaluation methods, we're also trying to sort of discern whether or not his interventions 10 years ago have made any difference whatsoever to how this body of research is conducted. It's not looking good. And that obviously prompts other questions, like why are people doing this work? And that's worth kind of, bearing in mind. Like, what's motivating people to crank these papers out? So, to epistemological matters. Hopefully that really brief introduction to sort of Bob's investigation there has made it clear that what's at stake with clever horses is an epistemological concern, and that the robustness of scientific work turns upon not just being able to say how much of something there is, but also to be able to give an honest and logical account of how well any estimate might correspond to the thing you wanted to measure in the first place. I hope that's not a controversial point. Bob decomposes that kind of idea using the sort of language of validity, which I think anyone that's done cognitive science work is probably quite familiar with. Different species of validity provide a way to think through how to assess experimental designs and evaluations. For instance, internal validity refers to the fitness of some experimental setup, external validity to how well an experimental results might generalize to new data, and construct validity to the mapping between how well an estimand actually maps to the thing in the world of interest. So for these purposes, is the idea that MIR has of genre anything like the idea that normal human beings have of genre? Assessing any of these requires both creativity and some degree of or access to domain expertise, right? So if you really want to figure out if your magic genre box has a valid construct behind it, then you actually need to talk to someone who's thought about genre, because there's subtleties there. So again, mechanical approaches to generating figures of merit aren't going to get you anywhere. Particular creativity is needed for opaque systems like deep neural networks to diagnose and reason about their performance. For instance, working out why a classifier might fail on particular examples could involve systematically preparing variations on those examples, which requires some domain knowledge, to probe what it is that the model seems to have learned. In the case of musical genre recognition, Bob's been able to demonstrate that certain trained models could be made to exhibit either complete perfection or complete wrongness, according to some figure of merit, just by making inaudible changes to the input audio, which is pretty bad news, right? You can get either 100% accuracy or 0% accuracy just by doing something that we can't actually perceive to the input data. So quite obviously, any attempt to assess construct validity also requires domain expertise, so I've already said that. For music genre recognition research, the objection from domain experts like Georgina Born is that genres, as a system of musical differences, are woefully underspecified by using only short segments of audio, which is kind of de rigueur in this research. Some genre differences are barely sonic at all, and hitherto there's been very little work that considers the other modalities that would need to be accounted for, not least the complexities of music's social mediations, let alone the fact that genres and their relations are temporally dynamic and perspectival. Likewise, as a matter of external validity, there are good reasons to doubt that the implicit teleology of this genre recognition work, that given enough data, these models would scale in such a way as to develop sensitivity to musical difference between musics of any time and any place. So we're kind of back to the Western generalization. If we're training these things as oracles on all the world's Western pop music, that gives us no basis to suppose whatsoever that they will ever understand the kind of systems of difference that apply to different cultures, or even within the cultures that you think you're studying. What all this implies, although not an original insight, is that even if machine learning in this register appears like a purely inductive exercise, the promise of a machine through which we mill some data and answers come out, doing it well, that is, more robustly, requires switching repeatedly back and forth between a creative disposition that is imaginatively engaged in trying to interpret and probe the limits of a model, and the technical disposition involved in implementing, specifying, and running such models. Which brings us to my first suggested pedagogical intervention. If this desired creativity isn't in evidence, then possibly it's because engineers are not being taught to think creatively about their work, and rather to approach evaluation as a purely formal matter. Moreover, even if they are creative, we should note that switching dispositions between registers and modes of reasoning is itself a learned skill, and a difficult one at that. On that basis, then, my suggestion is that users and designers of machine learning, in particular, would benefit from some opportunity to learn these skills, and that framing this in terms of the creative destruction of models could provide a provocative and playful frame to pursue this, besides any kind of other training in more formal dimensions of experimental design and evaluation. My second suggested pedagogical intervention would be that the current dominance of models based on prediction is weakened somewhat by exposing students to a wider range of data analysis paradigms. So what I mean by that is that almost all the research we see in this particular subdomain of MIR, but I think MIR more widely, is based on a kind of forecasting paradigm. I've trained you on this stuff. I give you a thing you haven't seen before, tell me what it is. But this is not the only register that computational data analysis can take. The motivation here is that beyond any issues with external and construct validity in the current approaches to genre recognition, these approaches offer a meager basis on which to start interdisciplinary endeavors that ask different sorts of questions, or that are more interested in explanatory rather than exploratory data analysis. So if we want to figure out how systems of genre work, then we're into explanatory territory, right? We're into asking why questions, not just does this exist, what might the next thing be, etc. As far as the Sonic Social Genre project is concerned, recent work in causal inference is an obvious candidate to expose students to, as it affords a markedly different way to think about data analysis. In particular, it requires one to lead much more explicitly and thoughtfully with theory, suffers fewer problems with interpretation, and as such, offers a more promising interface through which productive, that is agonistic, antagonistic, interdisciplinarities might be nurtured. So if we're starting with theories, then we've got something we can argue about and discuss and come to consensus and build up alternative models to test, rather than throwing some data into a black box and then shrugging our shoulders when we don't get the answers that we like. Furthermore, I think the process of adjusting these black boxes is so technical and so arcane that kind of cross-disciplinary work can easily stall or just founder altogether, because otherwise you have to go away and learn what hyperparameters are and what they will mean and bad things. Besides different technical approaches, we can also consider the value of different epistemic approaches, particularly with respect to the scope of models. How much and when it pays to generalize, or when focus upon and comparison between specifics may be more generative. I think this is a much more general point than just what happens in MIR or machine learning, but what happens when different branches of the social sciences come into contact with each other as well, that when, say, anthropologists and psychologists sit down, some of the mutual incomprehension might be about the scope of generalization that research is conducted at. A lot of my psychologist colleagues are looking for answers that are true for all time. And that can be fun and exciting to do. But I think looking at specifics and comparing what comes out of those offers different windows. And there's no reason actually that this kind of technical data-driven research shouldn't also do that. It's just a matter of habit. More generally, though, exposure to and creatively destructive playful engagement with as wide a range of historical and emerging paradigms as possible has much to recommend it. In terms of stimulating a more critical appreciation of underlying epistemological assumptions and their historicity, as well as perhaps bucking the implicit teleological, technological progressivism, whoa, got there in the end, implicit in some engineering discourse. Which is to say that there is often an unstated idea that the model that came out last week is better because it came out last week and scored better on a benchmark. But if we can't actually be sure that scoring better on a benchmark means that it's better, then not writing off out of hand the research of 20 years ago has, I think, a lot to be said for it, particularly in getting to grips with different ways that people historically think about computation, modeling, data, and how this relates to knowledge. Finally, last slide. This is a much more vague point, but I should kind of pay attention to an alternative possible explanation for the lack of imagination and curiosity that Bob and I have found in this work. Because we're only looking at published work, there's a selection bias, right? We never get to see the sort of quite possibly imaginative and curious work that was rejected, never submitted, or never written. That is to say, these patterns could well be due not to a lack in the capacity of these researchers to be creative and so forth, but are filtered out by the current regime of incentive structures and disciplinary norms. So, more speculatively, and much more generally than just considering the education of future designers and users of machine learning, I would very much like a future pedagogy that tries to inculcate tactics and strategies for the hard work of beginning to unwind this regime of incentives and norms. So the overproduction of papers, the overfocus on results rather than models, the quite remarkable hostility to theory that you see in some circles at the moment, I think all need some kind of undoing. Everyone seems to hate them. Nobody knows who likes them. And yeah, there's a matter, I think, of organising ourselves through teaching to get at some of this. Quite what these forms take, I'm deeply unclear on. However, it's pretty clear that both the difficulties of doing principled, radical, interdisciplinary work and the unfolding crises in the sciences are exacerbated by these regimes. Maybe, hopefully, you all have some cool ideas, because rising to some of our increasingly urgent challenges would seem to call for both more radical interdisciplinarity and more robust science. Cheers.
So we're now moving to a film presentation by Ollie Bown online. So Lely's going to set that up. And Ollie will be with us for the discussion and Q&A in the middle of the night.
Good day from the Hawkesbury River, just north of Sydney, bordering on the lands of the Darkinjun and Darug people, whom I acknowledge as this land's traditional owners. My talk today focuses on research I've conducted into the growing commercial creative AI sector as part of the MusAI project. And this is at a formative stage in terms of looking towards how this work informs AI pedagogies. I've been studying creative AI for over 15 years and in a range of guises, and it's a field with a history as old as computing itself, but it has taken a dramatic turn in the last few years. Two things have happened in a very short space of time. Firstly, techniques of machine learning got good, and not only that, quite surprisingly, generative machine learning came to the forefront of AI capability. AI-generated art and music shifted overnight from being generally quite mundane to frequently quite stunning. When I say good, I want to augment that with all kinds of caveats, but how good it is now or in the near future is not my topic today. Secondly, and this is my actual focus today, and I believe this is only partially related to the first event, a gold rush emerged to develop commercial applications of AI, largely in the mature startup ecosystems of San Francisco, London, and elsewhere. In music, we can see this starting in earnest around 2015 and accelerating into the 2020s, with a very large handful of startups funded to tens of millions of dollars in the first couple of years of the decade. And I'm referring to companies who are actually working in the space of automated music creation, a new frontier. Noteworthy startup acquisitions by big tech have already taken place in the music AI space. Elsewhere, some have made the essential step towards product market fit. Endel, perhaps the most notably, have achieved the remarkable feat of carving out an original niche in the music consumption market, a music streaming service free of the clutter of bands, artists, identities and fan bases that people reach for in favour of Spotify or Apple Music when they need help to relax or focus. I mentioned that the commercial AI boom is only partly related to AI's recent technological breakthroughs. Endel turns out to be a case in point, a company whose initial product success, I would claim, does not really depend on AI, but who have nonetheless made AI central to their image and vision. Endel's business is functional music, music that you can play when you want to focus, relax, sleep, or do a workout. Experienced as never-ending live streams, provided to subscribing users via a sleek phone app. There's a lot of psychological research into what makes functional music functional. Most of it is very simple stuff, the use of broadband spectra, pentatonic scales, simple repetition without surprises, and free of distracting lyrics. Endel have put these principles to great effect through a massive catalogue of in-house composition. What remains unproven is whether the AI-powered biofeedback that is central to their vision, their product vision, takes functional music to the next level. In my opinion, Endel's current product could quite easily have existed without AI, except that is for the seductive techno-cybernetic pitch. The manifesto states, "We're not evolving fast enough. Our bodies and minds are not fit for the world we live in." But in the world of startups, where the capitalist maxim of eternal growth is taken to its extreme, the current product is often not the ultimate goal. In my analysis of 4 AI music startups for a paper forthcoming in the journal AI and Society, I look at the complex interrelations between a founder's product vision, the hard work of music AI R&D, the acquisition of value, and companies' overarching innovation strategies. I claim that in this profoundly speculative field, and it's speculative in part because these are rarely product concepts that react to some obvious customer pain point like the need for a quieter vacuum cleaner. In this speculative field, product visions provide the motivation and framework for a particularly experimental and exploratory R&D, building not only software but the complex socio-technical assemblages of teams, content, workflows and data sets upon which the future products will be imagined and then built. As is obvious to founders and investors, but possibly less so to the rest of us, these complexes are forms of value in their own right, even in the absence of the envisioned product. This is one of two important points that arises. At any moment, a startup company and its noble vision might be asset stripped by an acquiring tech giant, and indeed this may even be the startup's goal. A second point, though, is that through its product R&D, commercial AI is in the business of creating new spaces of possibility, and this is a very long game. Take Endel again. Having built their powerful generative music engine on the back of a simple value proposition of smooth, ready-to-hand, functional music, they're now in a great position to explore, to imagine into existence, in a hackathon sort of way, a whole new world of possible musical experiences, such as adaptive music for the automotive industry, public spaces and events. Whilst AI wasn't essential to the immediate functional music product, it is essential to this speculative R&D venture, and Endel's success at building a user base serves not only as a source of revenue and as a font of highly granular and highly personal user data, but also as a real-world sandpit for new product experiments seeking to activate the law of accelerating returns. And as an aside, we might speculate that this lack of a large user base is one of the reasons that academic R&D has been of dwindling significance in this space. What does any of this have to do with pedagogy? Well, it's nothing new to argue that AI graduates going into startup or big tech should be broadly educated about ethics. And as Georgina Born's talk illustrates in depth, there is a sense amongst the MusAI project team that ethics in AI communities is easily stripped of its socio-cultural richness, reduced to individual rights and wrongs, do's and don'ts. To give meaning to the moral question they face, entrants to the AI workforce would therefore need to understand society, culture, and political economy. With respect to MusAI startups, those graduates need to understand two things. Firstly, how startup and innovation cultures work as systems and who they serve in a capitalist framework. Do they make the world a better place, as the Silicon Valley comedy series quipped? Or do they reproduce colonial power structures? Or do they lie somewhere in between? And secondly, they must understand how they impact musical cultures, given that the tools and technologies that arise from innovation cultures are inherently emergent. Consider the now raging copyright debate. The immediate moral issue on the table is whether AI companies have sneaked in a new form of intellectual property theft under an opaque technological veil. But from a sociological perspective, as is Born's focus, the language of property and theft is actually the entry point into a vastly complex terrain of culturally grounded questions: the role of art in society, the effectiveness of capitalism's paradigm of competitive individualism in delivering equitable and productive outcomes, and the very real questions of who actually wins. So jobbing independent artists are battling against technologists, but there are media and tech giants like Disney, Adobe and Getty Images whose assets combine vast war chests of content and phenomenal technological capability, and they have an easier ride. Sociologically speaking, as the writings of David Hesmanhaug and others have elucidated, one of the greatest challenges in the current copyright debate is that the various intrinsic values of music and the arts get pushed far into the background. Now that the products of creative work have been established as property to which we have rights, that becomes in itself fundamental, not a means to an end. But music serves people in myriad ways, which we must never forget. This matters to commercial music AI in how systems of value impact and are expressed by companies. There's now a prevalent trend for music AI companies to position themselves as for artists, signing up to initiatives like Fairly Trained and the Human Artistry campaign. In many cases, this commitment to the artist is specifically referring to the fact that they don't train deep learning ML models on creative works without permission. But there are many other reasons a company may or may not be for artists. Tellingly, some companies augment their pro-artist stance with statements like, "We are musicians ourselves." This should raise an eyebrow because it's an odd statement of allegiance when the company's financial incentives are potentially opposite to professional musicians. And there's a growing array of variations on this stance. As Soundful reassure their customers they needn't worry about artist strikes, Boomy at last reading the room have now removed the notorious website boast that they'd produced 13% and rapidly rising of all of the world's recorded music. But putting aside the fact that not infringing property rights is still a far cry from ensuring your business model doesn't diminish artists' revenues, those other intrinsic values of the arts seem vague enough to offer AI music companies much easier pickings for their value statements. Drawing on a framework outlining the values of the arts commissioned by the RAND Corporation, I'd like to look briefly at the idea of cognitive growth, the idea that the arts provides, albeit intangible, opportunities for deep experience that enlarge one's worldview. It's a vague concept and it risks smacking of elitism, but it's clearly important, perhaps central to people's everyday experience of art and music. Interestingly, AI music quickly provoked an impassioned trench war over themes related to cognitive growth. Where AI enthusiasts see opportunities for new musical forms and experiences, AI detractors anticipate the banalization of artists' experience. An AI music company can spin a yarn about how their work drives artistic practice forward quite easily. I expect my point here will now be easily anticipated. Putting such claims to the test can't be done by ethics alone, but it can be done. And we could begin to nurture value systems such as that. How are you ensuring your AI systems stimulate enriching engagement with the arts and are not just the next doom-scrolling technology for the attention economy, which is not an implausible suggestion. So back at last to pedagogy. The universities of the world eagerly feed the startup and tech sectors and get to claim their contribution to economic value. Insofar as universities serve the public good, we need to revisit how graduates are educated or continually work on it, not only with an ethical framework, but with at least a clear window into a socio-cultural and political economic stance on the world they work in. This new education should enable them to challenge what we might call value reductionism, such as the simplification of the complex array of value of the arts down to artist revenues and the idea that we are for artists. But it should also empower workers in small and big tech to do something about it, despite the conditions of their employment and incentivization. It'd be easy, but I think entirely wrong, to simply expect someone engrossed in tensor calculus and pointer arithmetic to also master humanities, let alone to do anything effective with that knowledge. Take it from me, I straddled those two cultures and they pull against each other for your attention in very different ways. There should be absolutely no shame in being a technical expert who has a potted understanding of culture, politics and history. So if we're to take our belief in the social seriously, then we should see it as at work in pedagogic design. It's not what you know, it's who you know. The future is relational. You need to situate people in the right context if you want them to work for good. Personally, I think there's still a huge potential to leverage the rise of the design field to this effect. Design now means two things. It's about forms, objects, functional stuff. But it's also become the discipline within tech companies that best attends to people embedded in webs of significance that they themselves have spun. This is most obvious in the human-centered design turn, which wrested the control of our technical products from engineers. As it's evolved, it's extended into forms of practiced anthropology, as in the work of Suchman and Genevieve Bell. And sure, design is probably not the right word. Bell, now Vice-Chancellor of ANU, drove the reinvention in Australia of cybernetics as a practice of attending to complex socio-technical systems holistically and morally. And I think her vision of applied cyberneticists taking centre stage in the design of technological futures is a good model, but it still has questions. With all this in mind, the properties of good pedagogical practice serving AI and its impact on culture might look like this. Firstly, as we've already claimed, the ethical must be situated in the social to be meaningful. When arguing about artists' rights, we should at least glimpse the socio-economic terrain from Disney to the global south. If code is the new literacy, or computational literacy or data literacy are now essential, surely a kind of, let's just call it Machiavellian literacy, is more of a long-standing concern. An understanding of the units of social organization you become a part of in your lifetime, the companies, classes, cliques and interest groups, and how they shape you. This is something that should build on and reinforce the progress we've seen in educating awareness about privilege and relationality. Secondly, in educational environments, we should firmly establish the idea that company values are commitments and are deep, not shallow, and that with deep commitment to values, the use of technology needs to be bound by those values. We can do that through regulation, but I think a powerful solution is again relational, and this is where pedagogy comes in again. We should establish greater lifelong engagement between places of learning and places of industry, the more intertwined integration between the academic and professional spheres, not just through innovation and economy building, but through a continued, transparent and open debate. In engineering and computer science, there is fluid movement between academia and industry. In the AI sector, this is happening more with policy and ethics personnel. I believe the design and social science field should explore more integrated relationships with industry that begin in pedagogy, branch out into collaboration, and come back to pedagogy in the form of industry-integrated PhDs and so on. The purpose of all this being to embed critical thinking and values into the commercial sphere. Thirdly, we should continue to push beyond design as the discipline that adaptively glues and mediates other people within and beyond commercial teams. Holistic, socially aware, and value-centered design has come a long way. It needs to continue to evolve to serve those above objectives. The latter is perhaps more practical, practical proposal. Engineers invariably benefit from learning UI, UX, IXD, and HCI. It empowers them to work with designers in the workplace. This is a disciplinary borderland that can be better mapped out. A good model for this type of interdisciplinarity that might be involved is Donald Campbell's fish scales model. Instead of disciplinary clusters that need to talk to each other, he conceives of a vast patchwork of custom expertises, the individual fish scales, overlapping to cover disciplinary territory evenly. This is an interesting model which is hard to achieve, and it was proposed in the 60s. But we can see that at work in academic interdisciplinarity. But also importantly, if we look at the MusAI startup sector, we have technologists working with musicologists and musicians and AI experts, data scientists, and so on. This is a constant exploration of boundaries between interdisciplinary teams, and there's a constant fluidity there. So this could become a two-way learning between academia and industry, serving those above objectives of better integrated value and critique. Thanks for your time.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rebecca Fiebrink. I'm going to talk a bit now, the last talk of the evening, about interdisciplinary AI pedagogies in practice. I want to start out with a bit of context. I'm a computer scientist. My research lies mainly at the center of machine learning, human-computer interaction, and creative practice. I'm also a classical musician and a music technologist by training. For most of the last 20 years, I've been building tools for creators to use machine learning in their work. And also deeply linked to this is working with creators and teaching them about machine learning in informal and formal contexts. So in my talk, I'm going to invite you to explore some questions with me about what radically interdisciplinary AI pedagogies might look like. Why are they needed? What are some differences from how AI is typically taught in computer science or data science contexts? And what are some of the tensions and challenges that can arise? I'll be starting with some examples from my own teaching at the Creative Computing Institute, as well as some examples from an AHRC-funded project called Transforming Collections. All right, so let's start out talking about some of my teaching at UAL. The students in this master's level unit I'm going to talk about mainly have art and design backgrounds. They've mainly been coding for about 6 months, so they have some comfort with coding, but they're not experts. And the aims of the unit are to teach students to build machine learning systems and integrate them into their own creative practices using code. So this isn't just about taking off-the-shelf tools, Photoshop and Midjourney, but it's really about building systems so that people have more flexibility. I also want to help students build awareness of ethical and social dimensions of contemporary machine learning practice within the arts and beyond the arts. I think this is important to give students the best foundation for deciding how and whether to use machine learning, as well as to do creative work that critically engages with machine learning. So some of the student projects from last year are up here on the screen. So we have some projects in music, like this music visualizer, some interactive art, like this one that you can turn yourself into a beautiful plant, or make a sticker filter, like a Snapchat filter, but only one that works on cat faces. We do have a number of critically engaged projects as well. This one is from a project investigating how we can use contemporary AI to portray matriarchal histories. And this one explores gender bias in AI-assisted self-portraits. So let me talk you through a bit of my pedagogical approach, ranging from the least to maybe the most surprising. So concretely, if we're going to teach machine learning to these students, we do need to aim for accessibility to people from non-technical backgrounds, while also enabling them to use machine learning in new, potentially unforeseen ways. The approach to this is fairly straightforward. We're not focusing on math and machine learning theory. Instead, I'm aiming to build a really high-level understanding of what machine learning does and how, with an aim towards helping people integrate that effectively into projects. We also do a lot of practice, getting people's programming skills ready to do machine learning work, and people work a lot from examples. Unsurprisingly as well, a lot of the content is tailored towards applications of machine learning in the arts. So students are seeing and exploring, discussing examples of machine learning in creative practice, and they're doing assessments that really focus on making creative work. Now, some of this work, as I mentioned, really does pay attention as well to social, cultural, and ethical considerations. These are woven throughout the unit, and some of this is done in a way that isn't really specific to creative contexts. For instance, when we do technical teaching, often this is linked to the discussion of the social context of algorithms and tools that we're seeing. But some of this work really starts to be unique and specific to the creative context of applications. And a lot of this comes out, as Georgie was mentioning earlier, it's culture all the way down, and there's interesting implications of this. So we do a lot of discussion around how values and culture are embedded in the machine learning systems that people might use and the types of data that they might find to be available or not to make the kinds of projects that they're interested in. So for instance, in music, one example that we've encountered with my students is until very recently, almost all of the approaches that allowed you to model and generate musical rhythms made the assumption that your musical beat was going to be divided into 2 parts and not 3, and certainly not changing between 2 and 3. And that in itself, that underlying representation meant that no machine learning algorithm built on top of that was going to be able to represent and generate music from a variety of Latin American and African genres, right? This is a big problem. And the last point, the most interesting one here, is I think it's important for me as an instructor to have my teaching reflect the fact that machine learning may be used in very different ways and for very different purposes than for students in a conventional computer science or data science course. And so I need to expose my students to the fact that there are these assumptions of mainstream machine learning which aren't always relevant to them. And I need to get my students to critically consider these and make decisions about when these are and are not relevant. So for instance, if you take a computer science course in machine learning, one of the first things you learn about supervised learning is that generalization accuracy is the most important. And sometimes that's true in creative practice, and sometimes it's not. So for instance, one of the applications of supervised learning that my students see is that you could use it to make a new musical instrument, where the input to a classifier or regression system is movements that you make with sensors. And the output of that model is used to drive different musical sounds as you move. And if you have especially a really low noise sensor, a person may create a really small training set of a few examples saying, hey, when I do this, I want this sound. And turns out that a really sort of bad classifier like K nearest neighbor is a great choice because it can learn efficiently from those examples. And people are able to really express in fine detail what they want the classifier to learn. And if you stick in a more sophisticated classifier that does something like regularization, people get frustrated because it's not listening to them. It's not picking up on all the details in those examples. Another example is that if we think about generative machine learning, often there's this assumption that we want to mimic real content or human-like content. And in the arts, sometimes that's true, but often really interesting art zooms in on particular glitches of machine learning, or even accentuates those glitches, or explores types of musical or visual or interactive outputs that aren't like those things that humans can make, because that can be really interesting. Similarly, this idea that bigger data is usually better. There's a lot of excitement and hype around sort of general purpose models for generating content. Turns out that in a lot of areas of creative practice, you may be much better off working with a very narrow training data set if you want to generate music that sounds not just like a particular genre, but sounds like the music you played yesterday. Actually, you don't want that music to be drowned out by other data that's less relevant. All right, so I want to mention here, going back to what Georgie said about different modes of interdisciplinarity, at the top here we have approaches to teaching and using machine learning that are very much about computer science in service of the arts, about helping people get to grips with the technical stuff and then just keep doing art. But I like, especially in this last point, it gets a little bit more complicated, right? Because a computer scientist who hasn't thought deeply about music and worked with musicians or artists isn't going to know these things. And in fact, I didn't know these things before I started working with musicians and artists about 17 years ago. And so it's really, important that this is a two-way street of learning, right? The things that we have to teach creative practitioners come from an understanding of creative practice. And I would also argue that as a computer scientist, this has been great for me because it enriches my understanding of what machine learning is, what machine learning can be good for, and how to think about it. All right. Now, I don't want to pretend that this is all easy. We've got it all figured out. There are many unresolved tensions and questions that I grapple with in this teaching. I'll show you a few here. So something I ask myself all the time is how much technical and programming expertise is really necessary or useful to give to these very diverse students with interesting creative ideas and a lot of other things they could do with their time besides learning to code. Similarly, how can I help navigate the benefits and costs of promoting a deeper understanding of dominant machine learning approaches, or even pushing students towards sort of buying into some of those approaches or assumptions. The more you're an insider in the language and assumptions of machine learning, the easier it is to develop really deep technical proficiency, maybe to appropriate these methods. It's also easier to tell sort of valid stories about your work if you have a conceptual component of your work and you want to have a cohesive story. But this, in my experience, can also really narrow students' imagination. And of course, another question is how do we encourage students to be critical of AI hype when also recognizing that they might benefit from it, right? Sticking an AI label on their work can get them a lot of attention. And in fact, that's why some of them might be in my class in the first place. All right. Next thing I want to talk about is the Transforming Collections project. This is an AHRC-funded project led by some colleagues in the Decolonizing Art Institute. And actually, John Gillick is a postdoc of mine. He's in the audience here today. The work that John and I and our collaborators are doing is largely focused on this kind of question. How can machine learning be useful to art historians, curators, and archivists to uncover bias in collections and make new connections between artworks and artists? The work that John and I are doing, I would characterize it as using a sort of loose action research approach. We're trying to build machine learning systems that support these goals, and we're also trying to understand the impact of these systems in practice. Now, superficially, this is a project that requires a lot of teaching, right? We have to teach our non-technical collaborators how machine learning works so that they can use it, right? But actually, in reality, the learning, the teaching that's happening here is much more complicated. I would characterize this as an iterative, multi-way learning process occurring between computer science researchers and developers, art historians, collections researchers and managers, and artists. And some of this learning is formal. We do occasionally do presentations. Some of this learning happens in sort of human-computer interaction style interventions like workshops or showing people paper or digital prototypes and learning how they work with those things or what kinds of ideas they have. But then there's also the bread and butter of any kind of research collaboration. We have meetings, we write papers together, we prepare presentations. And all of this continually together, we're striving toward trying to build a shared understanding of terms, right? What is machine learning? What is data? Surprisingly contentious. What is metadata? Trying to understand each other's goals and values, and then maybe getting to this, question of how machine learning can and should be used. We've learned a lot in this project so far, and I want to highlight some of the things that have big implications for how we build machine learning systems in this space, but also how we teach people about machine learning in this space, how we teach people who might use those systems, how we teach people who might build the systems. So first of all, some of the things we learned, we anticipated based on our prior work with musicians, with students at UAL and others. So for instance, we've found that one of the use cases we've decided to focus on involves users who might want to build new classifiers or new labels for concepts of interest to them, which might not be of broader interest to the world, but might be specific to a collection, to their institution. For instance, they might want to look at a body of text examples, maybe descriptions of artworks, and identify, are there art jargon terms here that are used and not explained? Or they might look at biographies of artists and ask, does this text prioritize the artist's racial identity or other aspects of identity? Now, these concepts that we might be classifying or labeling, as you'll notice, these are kind of ill-defined. They might be sensitive. They might be contingent. And our team at the Creative Computing Institute, we're therefore taking an interactive machine learning approach to this, in which instead of saying, well, let's start out and everybody has to label hundreds of examples of art jargon, and then we'll build the best classifier for those examples. Instead, we're taking the approach where someone who's a domain expert user could label a small number of examples from the data set that they care about, build a classifier, run the classifier, see what it gets wrong, and iteratively edit the data set. One other finding here, which is important, is that very early on, we came to a consensus that machine learning was not going to be useful in this project for replacing human reasoning, right? You're not going to build your art jargon classifier and then just run it and trust it. And furthermore, the use of these classifiers is always in human processes, which are complex and, again, also potentially contentious. And this requires particular levels of understanding, types of engagement with machine learning that allow people to manage machine learning within those processes. We also learned some things that were unanticipated with, again, huge consequences. For one thing, we see that collaborators on the project have often found this process of building and interacting with the classifier to facilitate a sort of close reading of the data that they have in front of them. And this can support users in critically examining both the data and the label concept itself. For example, helping them to refine their own answer to the question, what counts as art jargon, or what counts as an artist's identity? Furthermore, sometimes the purpose of machine learning looks quite different from what we would normally assume as like computer scientists or data scientists. One of the things people have been interested in doing is using machine learning to support them in an argument where they want quantitative data, but they don't necessarily need exact numbers. So we have a postdoc on the project who's interested in whether people writing about Donald Rodney tend to prioritize his Black identity over formal qualities of his artwork. And he's using machine learning to help him engage with this material to not just make a sort of classical art history argument, but also to add some numbers to it and maybe become more persuasive. There's also institutional conversations and arguments about, hey, what should we do with our data? Or what should we do differently? Or where should we put our attention and resources as an organization? All right, so again, all of these have implications for how we build machine learning tools, but also how we teach computer science and non-computer science people about machine learning. There are, again, unresolved questions and tensions here. How can we work towards building useful tools without embracing techno-solutionism? This is a perpetual question on the project. One challenge is that for many of our partners in the humanities and arts, being seen as somebody who uses machine learning can signify particular things about their values or their disciplinary commitments. And sometimes this is uncomfortable or worse, and there's friction here. And when this raises concerns, as it should, because machine learning is problematic and full of pitfalls and ethical problems, do we challenge this? How do we challenge this? And of course, there's questions like the fact that any infrastructure for labeling or categorizing necessarily is going to constrain the way that people think about what they can or should do with the data that they have. And this is never a neutral choice, even when everybody understands that there are consequences here and they have good intentions. All right, so few questions to wrap up with. They're big questions to put on the table if we're going to define any radically interdisciplinary AI pedagogy. At the surface, of course, a pedagogy is asking what skills and knowledge about AI should learners acquire? Why should they acquire this knowledge? And how can these things be taught? But we have to back up a little bit and recognize that any kind of teaching makes assumptions about the students. And we might ask what knowledge, expertise, epistemological orientations, motivations, and disciplinary identities do learners bring to learning about AI? And how can we teach in a way that supports a broader range of these than most current teaching approaches? This is all inflected by our particular answers to questions about, what is AI good for? Why would somebody want to use it in the first place? As well as questions about how AI's use shapes us and how it might shape us differently. And of course, no one discipline has answers to these questions. We have to make this an interdisciplinary project. And pedagogically, this raises questions about how do we prepare people to do that work? How do we prepare people like computer scientists, musicians, artists, humanities researchers to work together to understand AI and to build new things? So we're looking forward to exploring these in the next phase of the MusAI project. And if you are interested in these questions as well, please be in touch with us. So that's it for me.